One way a lot of people get their information is YouTube, and that may be where you know our next speaker from. He's a former co-host of Dogma Debate. He's all over YouTube. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming my good friend, Aaron Robb.
Hello, everybody. That was a really good event. The last time I protested Ken Ham, it wasn't as well organized. It was 107 degrees in Houston, same month, but in Houston, so it was nasty. And there was other Christians that were coming up to protest our protest then, too. And one of them was really obnoxious. I actually went up and put my nose against his nose on video. It was close to a bad situation. Once he left, wisely, I turned around and said, that guy was so obnoxious, and I pointed right at Eric Hovind and I said, he made you look good. So, before we talk about the Noah's Ark, I want to tell you the truth about the Tower of Babel. This is my perspective, this is my hypothesis, if you will. Once upon a time in the Mesopotamian Empire, it was a very advanced city-state. And people sent their children to formal public schools, teaching them how to learn to read and write in cuneiform, which is it's a sort of a tool that you press into clay to make letters of a sort, and then they would bake it into permanent documents. So we are talking about a literate community, so people can communicate across time. And that is until the fall of the Mesopotamian Empire. Now there is a tower called the Marduk Ziggurat that is attributed to be, or reputed to be, the kernel of truth behind the Tower of Babel. This was a project that was begun supposedly by Hammurabi around 1750 BC, or thereabouts, people think. And it was left unfinished. It was incomplete. So the only truth to that story was that when they began this massive project, the Mesopotamian empires fell and they became illiterate. That's the only truth to that story there is. But we have all of these tales that we've discovered from Ashurbanipal's library for things from 1800 BC to 2200 BC and so forth, and they all have strange parallels to what we read in the Bible. It's like so many recognizable details, and yet the important details are not there. So we have the stories of elements of Adam and Eve. We have Noah, for example, represented in the epics of Gilgamesh and Atrahasis, and also in the Sumerian king list. He's Ziusudra in one place, and Atrahasis in another, and Utnapishtim in somewhere else. Because, you know, when people appropriate other legends, the names of the characters change. That's why Greece and Rome have essentially the same gods, but their gods have different names. So we've discovered what the kernel of truth is in that. And archaeologists have went to that too. We know that the similarities between Babylon, Sumer, Akkad, and Chaldea, the way that they tell the stories of this great flood, they're clearly talking about the same event. They're talking about a real event. And that event was identified by archaeologists and geologists as occurring centered on the city of Shuruppak at the end of the Jemdat Nasr period in 2900 BCE, or thereabouts. And the interesting thing is that the depth of that flood, in the other accounts, in the previous pre-biblical accounts, is the same as what the Bible says. 15 cubits. And a cubit is this. My cubit may be bigger than yours. But it's 22 feet. Now, then, 22 feet was sufficient to cover all of the single-story dwellings. It would cover all but the treetops, and it was pretty devastating. For as far as you can see, the water would have covered everything if you were in that area. And of course, this is where the story came from. So, in the Bible, we get the reason that we have such an exaggeration is that we had these stories from 2900 BC and 2200 BC and so forth, and so many other tales. As I said, there's important elements of like everything in Genesis you can find in these various other Mesopotamian legends. And then they sort of get adapted, transfigured, and altered, however you will, because they're now being done by word of mouth. So people are remembering the old stories that they used to read about, but now nobody can read. There's a loss of education. Education was abandoned. And so these stories evolve over time. And by the time the Phoenicians wrote these same stories down about 1,000 years later, they had been adapted and appropriated into the burgeoning tradition of Judaism. And so this is where the Bible version of it comes from. And this is how somehow 15 cubits, as the Bible says, 15 cubits was the depth of the flood, and yet that same depth is somehow able to cover Mount Ararat, which rises 2.5 miles above sea level. Now people have told me, well, Mount Ararat wasn't really there, because all the land was flat, and that all the valleys and all the mountains were somehow caused by this great flood. Well, if that is the case, then bear in mind that Mount Ararat is a volcano. And a 2.5-mile volcano, and by the time it rises out of the sea, is probably not the best place to land a wooden boat. Now, let's just think about how absurd this is, because the reason Ken Ham built the Ark is because the Ark is the silliest story in the whole compilation of fables. Absolutely every part of it is impossible. So if you could create the illusion, then people will believe the silliest story of the Bible. If you can get the silliest story of the Bible to see it's real, then the others, the necromancer raising the armies of the undead, the talking snake and donkey, all of that becomes reasonably sensible comparison, right? But let's think about it. Noah, in the time that they attribute to Noah, at the time that this happened, 2900 BC, in the way that they were building ships back then, they hadn't invented nails. They lashed their beams together. These boats were tied together. They were made of reeds, essentially floating grass. Remember that Ken Ham said that this ark was built to the Bible specification. It's got a bow. It's got a keel. Did the Bible mention those things? No, it was an ark. Do you know what an ark is? Like the Ark of the Covenant that was supposed to carry the Ten Commandments, which is, by the way, another appropriated legend with no truth to it. An ark is essentially a shipping a shipping container. It's a box. And that's what barges at that time were. They were sometimes looked like bowls, or they looked like flat-bottom boxes, and they would be drawn by ropes that are pulled by cattle on the shore. So people would carry their livestock, which is where you get the 7 clean animals and all this. They're livestock. They're not every animal in the world. We don't have penguins on any of these things. So if he was going to build it to actual specifications, then the beams would be tied together. They wouldn't have steel rivets, screws, and specially patented braces designed only for this. Right? Think about the reality of this. If they wanted to show how realistic the Ark isn't, then let's just give them that they want to have all of the species of the world reduced to 1,400 created kinds. Now, I posted a video called the Phylogeny Challenge, demanding that they identify what the created kinds are. They can't answer that challenge because they know there is no such thing and that they're full of shit. But let's, for the moment, give them that. I mean, I understand that they don't believe in macroevolution over millions of years, but somehow they believe in a turbocharged, super, uber, hyper-caffeinated electro-mega-evolution happening in only a century or so. Because if you look at the ancient Egyptian artwork, you will see both felines and panthers, like a lion and a house cat, right? Those both already exist within 100 years of the Ark. That means that all these genus of cats, genus, not species, had to have evolved immediately, as soon as they got off the boat. So there's your super turbocharged. And they would give them that. Okay, so we have 1,400 created kinds, which can never be identified. You notice that the boat was only able to put, they couldn't put 1,400 stuffed animals on this boat. There wasn't enough room. Now the excuse they use is, well, we had to put in bathrooms and a gift shop. You've got 3 5-story buildings attached to this facade that you've created. Put your bathrooms in there. This building, you want to show how realistic it isn't? This is what we need to do. Put your 1,400 live animals and make sure that you have a year's supply of fresh water. Oh, it rained for 40. Yeah, I know. It rained on dead bodies for a month. And you had to float for 11 more months with a bunch of dead bodies. And it's mixing with salt now. So no, we're not going to use it. We have to have barrels of fresh water. Enough barrels of fresh water for all these animals for a year. Now, we have to have food for these animals for a year, with no refrigeration, no preservatives, no purifiers. How are you going to do that? Somebody I talked to today said, well, I work in a grocery store. I know better than that. Yeah, kind of obviously. And then somebody else was standing next to him beautifully says, yeah, and I work in a barn. I know a whole other perspective on that story. Because there's this thing, you got 1,400 species, and you've got 8 people. They better all have shovels. And good strong legs to run back up and down the stairs through the one window they're allowed to have. They're all going to suffer methane poisoning very, very quickly. Now, what are the lions and hyenas and wolves supposed to eat? Because you're not going to store your supply of their food, are you? Because Noah had all these animals come to him because God sent them, right? So all these animals show up to be saved. They didn't show up to be eaten, you know? Or did the rabbits get a different memo than everybody else? You know, it said 2 of everybody else, for some reason he wants 28 of us. Oh, surprise! So, what are the lions and hyenas and wolves supposed to eat when there's only 2 of all these species and you have to sit on this boat for a year? You have any idea how much these things eat? They could easily eat that crew of 8 and be done by the first week. So what are they supposed to eat when the boat lands? How long do they have to wait for all of these species to replenish before they can eat one of the original 2? What are the plant eaters supposed to eat? Let's assume that you could find some way of storing hay or something and that somehow magically feeds all of these animals for a year. What happens when they get off the boat? All the trees have been destroyed. The ground has been salted. There is nothing left. Everything would starve, right? Imagine now, your koalas. What are they going to eat while they swim back to Australia and the eucalyptus leaves that aren't there anymore? Or imagine the 3-toed sloth, the slowest moving in. It's swimming to South America. And what happened to everything that was in the oceans? The Ammonites, trilobites, mosasaurs, ichthyosaurs. Why are there whales and not any of these other things? You damn sure wouldn't be putting fully marine animals onto the ark, right? So why are they all extinct? Why would you put dinosaurs on the ark? You're adding an unnecessary complication to your story because they don't have any idea how many dinosaurs there are, right? So you got 2 T-Rexes on there. Oh, great. Whatever it is that they put on there, it doesn't matter. Why would God say to have all these animals come to Noah to be saved if they're all 90% of the species that have ever been on this planet all went extinct immediately as soon as they got on the boat? As you would expect that they would do. So there's no part of the story that approaches a reality. We know for many, many reasons that it couldn't have happened and that it didn't happen. And we know that the Native Americans were already in South America thousands of years before the ark. And the Egyptians moved right on in to their second dynasty. And neither of these groups ever noticed the flood because it never happened. We know it never happened. So he created this ark to deceive the naive, to believe what he knows is demonstrably, certainly not true. Because he says if you want to believe in salvation, which is the second half of the Bible, then you have to believe in creation, which is the first half of the Bible. So this is what this is all about. It's make-believe. And they will lie to defend pretend. So we didn't come to protest a boat, even though it'll never float. And we didn't come to protest an amusement park because it promotes fantasy. Otherwise, we would have protested Disneyland a long time ago. We're protesting what we see as state-funded, not just religion, but religious extremism. Because AnswersInGenesis.org has posted a statement of faith on their website where they have admitted that they have already rejected all the evidence there might ever be against all the nonsense they're selling and their deliberately dishonest denigration of science, such that no matter how true the truth really is, no amount of proof will ever change their minds. And Ken Ham famously admitted that blatantly in his debate with Bill Nye. So why do I get upset at this? Why am I protesting this? Because Ken Ham is lying to kids. And I see that as a form of child abuse. There's no other way I can interpret it because religion stumps the ability of the mind to reason. And that's what they do. This is indoctrination. And somebody said, well, you shouldn't indoctrinate people too, but don't. I'm not the one indoctrinating. If I teach kids, I'm teaching them how to think, where religion teaches them how not to. Thank you.